Now, I also want to say that tonight is the kind of event that we aspire to do at SFU. One, the first thing that makes it like the kind of event we want to have, excuse me. One is it's a dialogue about a pressing issue of our time that brings the communities together. So I'm really glad you're here for that. Secondly, it involves a thoughtful speaker who knows something about the topic. You're going to hear about him soon. And it also is a partnership among different people at the university. And you're going to meet them in a moment. But this is a partnership across 4 different departments of Sanbo Zen. Our Institute of Humanities, our Faculty of Education, our Graduate in Rural Studies, and the David Lamb Center for Asian Studies. So we're really pleased that you're all doing it. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague and one of the people who inspired me to make that happen, Dr. Adrian Lai.
My pleasure to introduce David Loy, Professor Loy. Just very quick, because the more time I take, the less time there will be for David. So it's going to be like very fast, introduction. Excuse me. Well, there's so much material, so I'm just going to look at my highlights. First, it says he's a prolific author, which is true. I don't know if I ever told you, but when I studied my doctorate way back in 1994, your book, Non-Duality, that might be your very first book, I'm not sure, I somehow ran into it, and that was, how should I say, it anchored my dissertation. So this is more for you than for, you don't need to know this, but we didn't really meet at the time, so it's been long ago, but I've been following your work, and I cannot keep up because he's written so many books. The latest being, and this is pertinent to the topic he's presenting, this is the latest book. When did it come out?
January.
January of this year, yes. Ecodharma, Buddhist Teachings for the Ecological Crisis. So here we go. And his book's been translated into many languages. And he's a professor of Buddhist and comparative philosophy. And what notable things can I say? He's a Zen teacher in Sanbo Zen tradition of Japanese Zen Buddhism. And there's a piece I just want to, because I was very delighted, I want to mention that in June 2014, David received an honorary degree from Carleton College. During its 2014 commencement, he gave a lecture. And then in 2016 April, he returned his honorary degree to the college to protest the decision of the Board of Trustees not to divest from fossil fuel companies. So if you go into his website, is just ample, all sorts of things you can read, watch, and that letter is there too. So highly, highly recommend that you check out his website. And I think I will just
I've already said who I am. I'm just going to say that the Graduate Little Stories is very honored to be one of the co-sponsors for tonight's event, so certainly welcome, David.
Thank you. Yeah, as is the Department of Humanities. We actually take the humanities beyond the European horizon, try to diversify what we offer students. So I teach courses on Buddhist ethics and contemporary society, addressing some of these questions you're raising. So that's part of the reason I think we're really keen.
Well, first of all, thank you to Professor Bai Hisong for this invitation, and also to Professor Anderson to both of them and to all of them for their warm introductions. I'm very delighted to be back here at SFU. The last time I was here was for the Ernest Becker commemoration. We had a conference, and I was really happy to be there for that because Ernest Becker, famed professor at SFU, was one of the major intellectual influences on my life. So it's a real honor and a pleasure to be back and talking in the same place that he did. Maybe I should give you the bad news first. As you've probably already figured out, I don't have any attractive slides to show you. It's just going to be me talking. So Apologies for that. So the question I'd like to address this evening is, what can Buddhism offer that can help us understand and respond to the ecological crisis? And before I try to answer that, please note that I referred to the ecological crisis. I didn't mention climate change, global warming, global heating, or even the climate emergency, because urgent as that is, those are all different words for the same thing. Urgent as that is, nonetheless, it is really still just the tip of a much larger ecological iceberg that we're facing today. And I think most of you here are already pretty familiar with that. The reason it needs to be emphasized, because we might have the idea that somehow if we can just transform from fossil fuel sources of energy to renewable quickly enough, then we can go ahead with the kind of lifestyle and the kind of sort of economic and technological development that we've been doing in the last century or so. And the reality is, of course, it's not that simple. Among the many other examples or aspects of the ecological crisis, the 6th great extinction event, where a very large percentage of the Earth's species are disappearing at rates between 100, somewhere between 100 and 1,000 or even 10,000 times faster than would be natural or normal. Just this morning I noticed somebody said, well, extinction event, that sounds kind of passive or kind of neutral. Maybe what we should be talking about is the first extermination event. Because the reality is that these extinctions are happening because of one particular species. They're not just happening because some asteroid is smashing into the Earth or volcanic eruptions. The reality is, of course, we are doing it. And there's so many other examples we can speak of. Plastics. I mean, plastics just started to become commercially available around the time that I was born, and within one lifetime. I mean, look what's happened, right? The way they break down and remain in the ecosystem in our bodies, and we don't really know what that means. But it's been predicted by the year 2050, there will be more plastic in the oceans than fish, which is another aspect, the fact that all of the major fishing places are fished to capacity or overfished. Toxins, so many toxins in the air, in the earth, in the water, in our bodies, and so forth. We can go on and on. Although I do want to mention one more, the fact that within the last 100 years, approximately half of all the agricultural topsoil has been eroded away around the world. So what we're talking about isn't just something that requires us to shift from one source of energy to another. What we're talking about is really a major civilizational challenge. It really does seem as if the kind of civilization that we've created is at its heart problematic, or how to say it, we've lost our way, something like that. I mean, I find it ironic that just at the time when we finally achieved what might be called a truly global civilization, it does seem to be self-destructing. What does that mean? Please feel free to come grab a seat. Could be a long time to stand up. So getting back to my question, our question, what, if anything, does Buddhism have to offer that can help us respond to the eco-crisis? And in one way you might say, well, maybe nothing. The Buddha lived in Iron Age India some 2,400 years ago. And of course at that time, the kind of crisis that we're facing now, it didn't exist. And so naturally, you can look through the Pali Canon and you're not going to find very much about anything like that or about how we might respond to it. And that applies not only to the Buddha, but also the traditions that developed after him. So, in other words, classical Buddhism, classical Asian Buddhism, or traditional Buddhism, it doesn't really have anything very specific to say about the kind of challenge that we're facing today. Nonetheless, it seems to me that there are a number of things going on in Buddhist teachings that have implications that are potentially very important for how we find ourselves today. And so what I want to do this evening is basically focus on one of those, which is the one that fascinates me the most. It's what I see as a truly amazing parallel between what Buddhism traditionally says about our individual predicament, what our fundamental problem is, and how we misunderstand that, often respond in ways that make things worse, and how Buddhism offers a path to solve that fundamental problem. That's traditionally what Buddhism is talking about. But it seems to me there's this amazing similarity between that teaching and our collective situation today. It's almost as if the first is kind of a microcosm and the second is the macrocosm, because they're both concerned about the same duality. You could say the fundamental sense of separation. On the individual level, we can see that a lot of, well, one way to understand the fundamental Buddhist approach, as I'll try to go into in a minute, is to talk about the sense of duality. The feeling that there's a me inside separate from the rest of you outside and the rest of the world outside. That's one way to understand the basic teaching. And here's the question that I'm going to try to address. Don't we have the same problem today, collectively, in terms of our species, or at least our major global civilization, that we have the sense of separation, duality between our own species and the rest of the biosphere? That's what I'll try to unpack a little bit. So what I'd like to do is basically two things. First of all, I want to spend a little time giving you my version of what I think the fundamental Buddhist teaching is, using very different language than the usual Four Noble Truths and so forth. I'm going to try to use more sort of modern psychological language. Again, I think this is a way of presenting the fundamental predicament that we find ourselves in, the perennial predicament. As much a predicament 2,400 years ago for the Buddha as it is for us today, although of course some details will be different. So let me talk about that first, and then I'll go ahead and explore what I see as these pretty amazing parallels with our collective situation today. Reality check. Does that make sense? Can you follow me so far? Okay. Buddhism begins with dukkha, which is certainly the most important concept in Buddhism. And this is especially clear in early Buddhism. Let me do a reality check. How many of you are familiar with the term dukkha? It's the word usually translated into English as suffering. But that makes sense only if you understand it in the broadest possible sense. Not just physical and mental pain, but dissatisfaction, frustration, anxiety, dis-ease. Basically, what dukkha seems to be pointing to is that although we tend to think of ourselves, we think that if we just solve our problems and get everything we want, that we're going to be happy. And I think the fundamental teaching about dukkha is that it's not so simple. It's the nature of our unawakened minds to be bothered by something. And I think we know this. I think we know how, if we don't have a big problem in our lives, it's very easy, kind of natural, to sort of find a small way and kind of blow it up, right? Anyone ever experienced any, something like that? And of course, we can understand that in evolutionary terms too, why we are the anxious animal, right? That's very good for survival and perpetuation of the species. I mean, you want a lot of false negatives. You don't want false, did I say that right? You want a lot of false positives. You don't want the false negatives, right? That crackling in the underbrush, right? So, and the Buddha himself, he made it very clear. This is the central concept at the heart of his teaching. Four Noble Truths. They're all about dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, the Eightfold Path to end dukkha. And the Buddha explicitly said all he had to teach was dukkha and how to end it. When we go back to the earliest teachings, they distinguish different types of dukkha. There's the usual physical and mental discomfort. There's also dukkha due to impermanence, the fact that everything that arises tends to pass away, and maybe the best example of that, of course, would be our own mortality. As the existential psychologist, preeminently Ernest Becker, pointed out, our inability to accept our death is also our inability to live fully. But it's the third type of dukkha that I want to focus on today, which is connected with what I think is maybe the second most important concept in Buddhism. And that's the term anatta, usually translated as no self, not self, non-self, something like that. This very strange, counterintuitive teaching that there is no self-existing separate self. Very strange. When you go back to the earliest teachings, there's some very subtle, sophisticated doctrines whereby they sort of deconstruct the sense of self. But I don't think we need to talk about those today. I think the fundamental point is actually quite simple. The concept of the self is dualistic insofar as we naturally distinguish that self from that which is not self, the other. Whenever you have a self, we're sort of presupposing that which is not self, the other, the outside. So what Buddhism is pointing at here is by connecting dukkha, suffering, with the delusion of separate self, what it's saying is that in some sense is maybe the most fundamental source of dukkha for us. This delusion of separation, the delusion that there's somehow a me inside, maybe behind my eyes, inside my ears, whatever, looking out at the rest of you outside and the rest of the world outside. As Thich Nhat Hanh put it very well, we are here to overcome the illusion of our separation. We are here to overcome the delusion of a self, not self, of that kind of duality. Now, in the 20th century, I think maybe a lot of the studies, psychological studies that were done, give us an advantage in understanding what Buddhism is talking about here. Because we know, right, infants, babies aren't born with a sense of self. Right? That's something that develops as they are socialized. The sense of self is a psychological, social, and linguistic construct that develops as the child grows up, as the child learns to use language in certain ways, but also learns to see itself in the way that others see it. This is very important. We've all heard stories about, for example, wolf boys in Aveyron who were sort of disappeared, raised by wolves. It's interesting because if they're not recovered really quickly, they lose certain important developmental stages, and they will never attain the sense of self that the rest of us naturally develop. And therefore, we can also say that they're not really fully human. Because to be human is not just a biological phenomenon, it's also to be socialized and to develop the sense of self, which is so essential to function in the modern world, right? Or any world. Okay? So, the idea that the sense of self is a construct is not so foreign to us. But here's the interesting question. What Buddhism emphasizes is not, or implies, this is my way of understanding its claim. What Buddhism is saying is not just that the sense of self is a construct. It's also linking that with dukkha. It's saying that there's a fundamental dissatisfaction or dis-ease built into that delusion of separation. And I think the Buddhist perspective here, how to say it? I think we can say it quite simply, actually. I think it's not so hard to see, actually, what Buddhism is pointing at here. If the sense of self is a construct, It means that it has no separate reality of its own. We could say that the sense of self is composed of a cluster of interdependent processes, ways of thinking, feeling, acting, reacting, remembering, planning, intending, and so forth. It's the way that these processes, all of them sort of insubstantial, changing all the time, it's the way that they work together that creates and sustains this sense of separation. What that means, therefore, is that the sense of self is inherently uncomfortable. The sense of self is inherently anxious. It's basically insecure. Why? Because there's nothing there that could be secure. It doesn't have any reality. That's the first point. What I think is really important, though, is how we experience that insecurity. Because we don't really understand what's going on, but instead, I think the way that we normally experience it is as a sense of lack. By lack, I mean the sense that all of us have, that something is wrong with me. Something is missing. Something isn't quite right about me. Or I'm not good enough. Anybody ever experienced that before? I really believe this is one of the secrets of life. We all have this sense of lack. But we don't realize that everyone else has it too. We think that it's our own individual problem. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that this constructed sense of self is like a coin, and the other side of that comes with it, is the constructed sense of lack. The feeling of not good enough, the feeling that something is wrong with me. The sense of self that we all have, and to a certain extent we all need to function in the world, it's shadowed or even haunted by this sense of lack. But again, how do we experience this sense of lack? I think this is where social conditioning becomes really important. There's feeling something is wrong with me. What is it that's wrong with me? I think it's interesting if we think about it in religious terms. Think 1,000 years ago, if you're, say, a French peasant, how are you going to understand your sense of lack? Well, actually, you have a religious tradition that's there, right? You have the Catholic Church, which is going to explain it in terms of your own sins, but also you're heir to the original sin of Adam and Eve. And the Church also gives you a way not only to understand your sense of lack, but to respond to it, to understand it, to cope with it. It gives you penance, pilgrimages, confession, Eucharist, and so forth. So you have a whole social structure built around explaining your sense of lack and how to deal with it. But now fast forward back to the present, and it's interesting. Although I tend to think that maybe religion develops largely, that it's our collective way of coping with our sense of lack. At least that's one of the main factors. Come now back to the present, where we're in the 21st century, and those old religious explanations don't satisfy us in the way that they did for people for many centuries. Which means that we have a sense of lack still, all the more so because we're so much individualized in the modern world, but we don't have those traditional religious ways of dealing with it. So how do we understand our sense of lack? How do we understand what's wrong with us? Well, coming from the United States, I can't say what it's like here in Canada, but I know that one of the first things that we learned in the United States is we don't have enough money. Right? And it doesn't matter how much money you've got, you don't have enough. Right? I mean, I think we all tend to be conditioned in that way. Not only money, but you could say consumer toys. And there's a number of other ways in which we understand our sense of lack too. For example, fame. Interesting how in the modern world we spend so much of our time looking at screens of one shape or another. And the screens tend to show us the same A-list celebrities or politicians, and seeing them repeatedly gives them a sense of, they seem to be more real than we are because they are famous. Everyone knows them. Compared to them, I'm anonymous. I'm nobody. So there's a kind of important contrast there. That preoccupation with, like, every teenage boy wanting to be a rock star, right? You know, where does that come from? Other examples, bodies. I think traditionally, maybe it's different now with male metrosexuals, but I think traditionally, at least at the time that I was growing up, women were taught to identify more with their bodies and how, again, if, and I guess I didn't say this, if your understanding and solution to your sense of lack is to get enough of something out here, whether it's money, fame, power, whatever. The tragedy, of course, is that it doesn't matter how much you get, because that's only a symptom of the fundamental problem. You're not going to have enough, and therefore you're still going to, you might get a lot of money, but it's not going to resolve your fundamental sense of lack. And that can apply to women's or anyone's bodies as well. If your lack project, that's what I would call it, your lack project is to have a beautiful, perfect body, well, it's never going to be perfect enough. I remember reading an interview with Cindy Crawford some years ago, and, you know, very beautiful supermodel and so forth. And in that, she was preoccupied with the fact, it really bugged her, that she had a little bit of cellulite right here. You know, that was really bothering her. Interesting. So anyway, I call these lack projects, all of these ways in which we think that if we just had enough of this out here, somehow it would fill up the sense of lack. And fundamentally, they're all delusive because they can't do that. I also sometimes call them reality projects because, again, the fundamental problem is we don't feel real enough. And if we can just get enough of something, and then somehow the idea is somehow that will make us feel more real. Does this make any sense? Yeah. So if this is one way to understand the fundamental problem that Buddhism is talking about, and I realize I left out one example, one more example I think is worth mentioning, romantic love. The idea being that if, and I don't know if this still works in the same way it did for my mother's generation, right? But the idea that there's that one person out there, and if you can just find that person, then that's going to fill up your sense of lack, or I guess that's not the way they say it. Then that's going to make you feel whole. And they lived happily ever after. Right? And now, that's not criticizing romance, love, any more than it's criticizing money or fame, except insofar as you're using them for something that they can't provide, right? If your partner is your way of filling up your sense of lack, you're going to have a lot of problems, right? It's a heavy burden for that person to bear. So you can see what I'm getting at here. These are all lack projects. In contrast to these, and you know, we could spend time talking about, for example, the way that our economic system reinforces them, reinforces the idea of consumerism. The fundamental idea of consumerism, that's the way to fill up. It's always the next thing you buy that's going to make you happy. We could talk about how it fits into our economic system and so forth. And the other thing that I forgot to mention too, all of these lack projects involve preoccupation with the future. Insofar as we have the sense of lack, it's something we feel now. A lack project is always, I'm going to be okay in the future when I get enough of this. Right? Please note that because we're going to come back to it. Okay, that's the problem. That's one way of articulating what I think Buddhism is saying, and not just Buddhism. Buddhism is one vocabulary, one way of expressing, one story to express this problem. Buddhism, at its best, shows us how to solve the problem, which fundamentally involves deconstructing and reconstructing the sense of self, and therefore deconstructing the sense of lack. I say deconstructing and reconstructing, it suggests the one precedes the other, but actually I'm talking about two processes that actually are going on at the same time. By reconstructing, I think this is the way that perhaps karma should be understood. And frankly, I wonder if we've sort of grabbed that by the wrong end, you know. When you look at the original Buddhist teaching about karma, what the Buddha emphasized was motivation, intention. And the word karma literally means action. It doesn't refer to the fruits or the consequences in the way that we tend to do informally now, right? So what I think the Buddha is pointing at is that there's something very simple, not necessarily easy, but there's something very simple that we can do that can transform how we experience other people and the world in general, and how other people will experience us and respond to us. And it's simply this: transform your motivations, transform your intentions. If you are motivated by what Buddhism calls the three poisons or the three fires, greed, ill will, delusion, you are literally going to live in a different world. You're going to experience a totally different world from somebody who's motivated by generosity, by loving kindness and wisdom. I think that's very powerful. A pickpocket, how is a pickpocket going to experience this room? A pickpocket's going to see our pockets. A Buddha will see our Buddha nature. And there's a lot that goes along with it in terms of the emotional experience there, right? I don't know if anybody remembers the last line of Spinoza's Ethics, Part 5, his last proposition. Latin, beatitude, beatitudo, happiness. Happiness is not the reward for virtue. Happiness is virtue itself. What's he pointing at? By virtue, if we understand a certain way of relating to the world involving certain motivations and intentions, the virtuous person lives in a different world than the selfish, greedy person. That's the reconstruction of the sense of self. And you can see the connection with separation. Okay, the pickpocket, the greedy person, reinforces their sense of separation by the way they relate to other people, right? So if, for example, I'm a pickpocket, I can't just tell you I'm a pickpocket, I'm gonna, right? I've got to play a game. I can't reveal my real self. I've got to manipulate the situation in a certain way, and that's going to reinforce the sense of separation. Whereas that other side, the virtuous side, the generosity, loving kindness, the wisdom of realizing that we're all interconnected, that's not going to reinforce the sense of separation. It's going to have the opposite effect of feeling more connectedness, more interconnected, more interdependent, as Buddhism emphasizes. But what about the deconstruction? And this is what I think where we get to a way of understanding the emphasis, all the emphasis that Buddhism places on meditation. Right? What's going on when we meditate? Well, if you're really focusing on your meditation theme, for example, breath counting, all kinds of thoughts and feelings are going to come up while you're doing that. But because you're focusing on the breath counting, you're not going to identify with them. You're not going to get carried away. Or if you do, it won't be for long, you'll come back. In other words, when we're meditating, the usual sense of self, composed of these habitual ways of thinking and feeling and acting, these ways, the sense of self tends to sort of disintegrate or disappear, break down, because all of the mental processes that support it, that reinforce it, you're not identifying with them. I think it was Chogyam Trungpa who said, awakening is always an accident, but meditation makes you accident prone. So, Japanese Zen master Dogen put it very well when he said, you know, to study the Buddhadharma is to study the self, or to investigate into the self. To investigate into the self is to forget the self, to let go of the sense of self. And he also described what can happen when we do that, the sense of non-duality, where the sense of separation disappears. After his own awakening, Dogen said, "I came to realize clearly that mind is nothing other than rivers and mountains and the great wide earth, the sun and the moon and the stars." The Neo-Vedanta Nisargadatta expressed it even better, in my opinion, when he said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life flows." Beautiful. But you can see my point, how the awakening here has to do with the letting go of the sense of self, therefore letting go of the sense of separation. And what's important about that, of course, is that insofar as I'm motivated by this sense of lack, I have the sense of self that I want to fill up, these lack projects or reality projects, right? It's how to say it? It's inevitably, when I'm doing that, there's a certain kind of self-preoccupation, right? Self-centeredness. I have this sense of lack. What can I do to fill it up? And it keeps me self-preoccupied. But if there's the awakening of letting go of the sense of separation and realize that I'm not separate from all of you, and therefore my well-being is not separate from your well-being, this can lead to a totally different way of living in the world, which in Buddhism we call the Bodhisattva path. That is to say, the meaning of my life transforms. It's not about what I can get out of it, but rather what can I do to make this place better for all of us, because I don't feel separate. Part one finished. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Is that okay? Is that? Yes, ma'am. Briefly, I don't want to have a long, but...
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this, like the lack of realness.
The fact that one way to understand the sense of lack is that we don't feel real enough. Yeah, how to talk about that? I'm not sure how to answer that right now, but I'm also concerned not to spend too much time on that because I've already spent too much time on part one of the talk. Maybe we can come back to that a bit later, and that gives me time to think about it too. So maybe I can think of an answer. So.
If it helps, some people have experienced it. If it helps, I know people have experienced it. That is an experience that it helps.
Yeah, well, we should, that might be a good topic for a discussion, depending on the timing. Yeah. So what have I said? The fundamental problem is sense of separation. We often, and not only that, not only a sense of separation or alienation, but there's a dukkha, there's a suffering built into it. But nonetheless, we often misunderstand that and react in ways that just make things worse. For example, becoming greedy for money or whatever. But in fact, there is a solution, but it involves really deconstructing the sense of separation and living in the ways that are implied by by the realization that we're not separate from each other. Now, the reason I summarize that is I think it's exactly the same problem that we're faced with today collectively in relation to the biosphere. In other words, I think that is at the heart of the ecological crisis, and I'll spend the rest of my time trying to unpack that a little bit. Because we not only have individual senses of self, right? I'm not just David Loy, I'm also a man, not a woman. I'm American, not Canadian. I'm white, I'm not Chinese, right? So we also have these group senses of self, certain kinds of tribalism where the inside becomes separate from the outside. And what I want to talk about now is, I think, maybe the largest collective sense of self, which is our species sense of self, our collective delusion sense of self. How to say it? Yeah, maybe I should say civilizational. There are some small groups of people that maybe don't fall into this quite so much, but nonetheless, the fact that we, as a now global civilization, have a very strong sense of our identity as separate from the rest of the biosphere. That's really what I want to talk about. And the important first point, therefore, to make is that just as the individual sense of self is a construct, likewise, this collective sense of separation from the rest of the natural world is also our collective construct. Right? And this is obvious. I mean, we know this. Right? We know, for example, that if we don't like the way we live together, we can change it. We can pass laws. We can have reform movements. If they don't work, we can have revolutions. But how we live together is something that we decide together, at least in principle. And we take this for granted. Right? What's interesting, though, is that actually throughout human history, this is not the way that most civilizations have understood themselves. We trace Western Civ back to the Greeks, and one of the reasons we trace it partly back to the Greeks is that the Greeks were, as far as I know, the first to make this very important distinction between physis and nomos, between the natural world and human culture. It was because they made that distinction that they could create democracy, which presupposes, of course, that you can reconstruct how you live together. Now, obviously, their democracy had a number of problems. Women and slaves needn't apply, but it still built into it this fundamental understanding that society is our construct. What's interesting, not just interesting, what's really important, I think, is that if you go back before the Greeks, if you go back to archaic civilizations, I'm thinking of, for example, Mesopotamia, or ancient Egypt, or the big three pre-Columbian civilizations of the Americas, right? The Aztecs, Incas, Mayas, and so forth. If you go back to those civilizations, they didn't have that understanding that the Greeks did. They tended to take for granted that their hierarchical social structure with a king or an emperor or something like that on the top was as natural as their ecosystems. Not only that, but the role of religion in those societies was, as it were, to prop up that social structure. They didn't distinguish between sacred and secular authority. For them, it was sort of all the same. To be a religious person in that society was to play a role in the social order, to support the hierarchy, which was also a sacred hierarchy. They took that for granted. Now you may wonder, why am I making such a big deal of this? Because the people in those societies, although none of us would want to live in them, the people in those societies had something that we today have lost. And that is a really important source of dukkha to us. But by which I mean, because the religion was integrated into the social structure, which was also integrated into the natural world, the ecosystems, when they were born into that, they knew what their role was. They knew what their job was. They had a role to play. And furthermore, every one of those societies or civilizations that I've studied, that I've been able to study, they all believe that collectively they had a really important job. They had a role to play in keeping the cosmos working. The Mesopotamians believed that humans had been created by the gods as their slaves. That's why we needed to make sacrifices and have ziggurat temples for them. Maybe the best example, of course, would be the Aztecs. I think we're all familiar with the unsavory story of how they would drag their war captives up to the top of their step pyramids and cut out their still beating hearts with an obsidian knife and offer them to the sun god, right? Why? Because that was necessary. It was necessary to feed the sun god in that way to keep him on his path. And if you didn't do it, he would get lost or angry. And you do not want to get the gods angry. You see, the people in these societies, I want to reinforce this, they had a role to play. At least that's the way they understood. It may not have been a very nice role, but the result was they had a kind of social security, you could say, that we have lost because of our disconnection from the earth. Let me read the next paragraph or so. Because they understood their society to be built into the cosmos, their essential social role was also built into the cosmos. Both personally and collectively, they knew why they were here and what they had to do. Today, in contrast, the meaning of our individual lives and societies has become something we have to decide for ourselves. In a universe whose meaningfulness, if any, is not something we agree on. The result is increasing anxiety about who we are and what it means to be human. Our ever more powerful technologies enable us to accomplish almost anything we want to do, yet we don't know what we should do. Insofar as we can no longer rely on God or God-like rulers to tell us, we are thrown back in ourselves. And the lack of any grounding in something greater than ourselves is a source of dukkha. Anybody here read the book by Yuval Harari called Sapiens? A Brief History of Humankind? Yeah. Let me just read the last couple sentences of that book. This is the very end of the book. Despite the astonishing things that humans are capable of doing, we remain unsure of our goals and we seem to be as discontented as ever. We've advanced from canoes to galleys to steamships to space shuttles, but nobody knows where we're going. We're more powerful than ever before, but have very little idea what to do with that power. Worse still, humans seem to be more irresponsible than ever. Self-made gods, we are accountable to no one. We're consequently wreaking havoc in our fellow animals and on the surrounding ecosystem, seeking little more than our own comfort and amusement, yet never finding satisfaction. This is his last sentence. Is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who don't know what they want? What's my point here? We have a collective sense of dukkha because of our collective sense of separation from the earth. We try to find meaning by ourselves disconnected from the earth, and it doesn't work. And again, the heart of the problem, I think, why we don't know what we want is that we no longer believe that we have any role to play in the cosmos. Since we know that humans, like all other species that have evolved, are mere accidents of genetic mutation, we're accountable to no one and nothing beyond ourselves. All we can do is enjoy ourselves, if we can, while we can, as long as we can, until we die. That's not really fun, folks. That's dukkha. Does this make sense? Can you see the analogy, the collective version of the individual problem? No wonder we feel dissatisfied and act irresponsibly. In other words, just as on the individual level, we have the sense of separation, a constructed sense of separation. And along with that, it's not just a sense of separation, there's a dukkha, there's a fundamental dissatisfaction built into that. Collective uncertainty about what it means to be human and what it is that our now global civilization should be doing. On the individual level, do you remember how we respond? Remember how this sense of lack that we have, we misunderstand the fundamental problem and we look out here, lack projects, reality projects? Is there a collective version of that? Is it perhaps our obsession with progress? That is to say, never-ending economic development, economic growth and technological development? I think the ideology of modernity is progress. Remember what I said about the individual lack projects? They're always future-oriented. the whole idea of progress is that the future is going to be better than now. And one of the big social problems now is more and more of us don't believe that anymore. We don't believe that things are getting better. And the whole ideology is collapsing, and I think we're starting to see some of the consequences of that kind of a breakdown. So we may wonder, when will we consume enough? When will we have all the technological development that we need? These questions seem so odd to us because, of course, we know that there's no end to it. But here's a really important question then. Why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? Technological and economic growth in themselves may be valuable means if they're something that you want to use them to accomplish, something important, if we have a role to play. But because we no longer know what our role, what our goal, what our endpoint should be, the means have become the ends, do you see? We don't know what to do with it, so it's just more and more and more for the sake of itself. That's the meaning of human civilization. They function as forms of secular salvation that we seek but never quite attain. This, again, always future orientation. I think not knowing where to go or what to value, our civilization has become obsessed with ever-increasing power and control. Make sense? So what's the solution? Remember the Buddhist solution, deconstructing and reconstructing. Deconstructing the sense of self, and maybe I didn't make it clear enough, but it's important from a Buddhist perspective that one doesn't ever get rid of the self. The reality is, from a Buddhist perspective, there never was a separate self. There's the delusion of separation. So it's not about getting rid of the sense of self. It's not about getting rid of the self or even getting rid of the sense of self, but realizing its emptiness or realizing its constructiveness. So what's the collective equivalent? Returning to nature? Or does that have exactly the same problem? Because we can't return to nature because we've never been apart from it. Right? We have the delusion of separation from nature. Right? If you think we're separate from nature, try stop breathing for 4 minutes. Or stop drinking water for a week. Or stop eating for a month. See what happens. What we call the environment isn't just a place where we happen to be located. The biosphere is the ground from which, within which, we rise. We're not in nature. We are nature. The earth is not only our home, it's our mother. And except for fantasies about terraforming Mars and so forth, we never cut the umbilical cord. Before the earth is a source of resources, it is the source. The air in your lungs, like the water and food that enter and pass through us, are part of a greater holistic system that circulates. Human bodies are made of the same elements that compose the oceans, rivers, mountains, and trees. Our blood is salty because it duplicates our original ocean home. And genetically, of course, we have something like 99% of our DNA, similar to our closest primates, the chimpanzees and bonobos. As Thomas Berry put it, our species has never been separate, just autistic. We are the autistic species. Yeah, let me just riff on that a little bit. Autistic, it's interesting, this Ecodharma center that I'm a part of in Colorado, we go out in the natural world and how important it is to go out by ourselves. If you think about the story of the Buddha, meditating by himself under the Bodhi tree, or Jesus, after his baptism, 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, or Muhammad in his cave, right? It's interesting how important it was for these religious figures to kind of go out. The problem with our autism is that we find meaning in words. We find meaning only in language. We've lost the ability to hear what the birds are saying, what the trees, what the wind is saying. Back in the days when we were hunting-gathering, we had to be embedded in the natural world. We had to think like the prey. We had to think like the predators. But somehow we're so self-enclosed, we've almost lost our ability to connect with these other natural phenomena. Okay, anyway. Both individually and collectively, the sense of self is a construct haunted by dukkha. We respond in ways that often makes things worse. We need to sort of not return to nature, but realize that we've never been apart from it. But how do we do that? What is the collective version? I mean, in Buddhism, we talk all the time about awakening or enlightenment. Thich Nhat Hanh says, quote, "The Buddha attained individual awakening. Today we need a collective enlightenment to stop the course of destruction." Sounds good, but what does that mean, a collective enlightenment? What would that really mean? Does it mean everyone's going to convert to Buddhism and we're going to meditate hard enough to wake up and then there'll be enough of us to start a social movement and we're going to change things? I don't think so. Right? What's going on here? How do we understand it? There are some interesting things in Buddhism. Let me just mention two phenomena that I think are quite fascinating here. There's this old quandary in Buddhism. If the sense of self, if the self is a construct, an illusion, who or what awakens? Right? And there's this famous story in the Pali Canon where right after his enlightenment, Buddha was approached by Mara, who sort of challenged him. You think you're awakened. Who authorizes? Who verifies that? Anybody remember what the Buddha did?
Touching the earth.
He didn't say anything. He touched the earth. Wow, what's going on there? Right? Can we understand this as Thomas Berry and some of the new cosmologists do? Can we understand our species, that awakening is, as it were, we are a way in which the earth is becoming aware of itself? Can we understand the Buddhist path in that way? But that's not what I want to focus on as a way of finishing here. Rather, I want to suggest that maybe the collective enlightenment that is necessary is in fact happening, but in a slightly different way than we might expect. Anybody here read Paul Hawken's book, Blessed Unrest? Paul Hawken is he's a Zen student for what it's worth. He's also an important lecturer, talks about greening capitalism. He wrote this book in Blessed Unrest as a result of this big realization he had. He would travel around the world lecturing, he'd collect business cards, stick them in a drawer. One day he started counting the cards, did some research online, and he concluded that something is happening right now that's never happened before in human history. A very large number of groups of people, most very small. He originally estimated between 1 million and 1.5 million. I think now he would say over 2 million. Groups of people springing up all around the globe in different places and different cultures to work for social justice and sustainability and the healing of the earth. And what I found most fascinating about that is not only that it's never happened before in human history, but he has a whole chapter in that riffing on the metaphor of the immune system of the earth. He understands, he's saying, can we understand what's happening socially? All of these groups. Is this now the time to talk about what's starting tomorrow? I don't know how many of you are aware of the huge demonstrations that are going to be happening. Can we understand that as well? Can we understand this as the immune system of the earth, springing up, as it were, spontaneously to heal itself? As I think you all know, we're in a very critical situation. Maybe we don't need to understand the collective enlightenment in the traditional Buddhist fashion. Maybe we can understand that what's really going on here, from a Buddhist perspective, we can call these people, these groups, bodhisattvas. Because the definition of a bodhisattva, in part, is that people are devoted. They find the meaning of their lives not in, what's in it for me, getting enough money or power or fame, or whatever. But they find the meaning of their lives in doing what they can to make the world a better place. And let me just finish by saying, do you remember what I said just a moment ago, that the fundamental problem for us is that we don't seem to have a role to play compared to those archaic civilizations. We're just kind of accidents here. There's no meaning to human life, and of course, because we feel separate. Insofar as we're autistic, what's the meaning of our lives? Well, there's no God, there's no, let's just enjoy ourselves as much as we can. What I want to suggest to you, if we understand this metaphor of the immune system of the earth, all these different groups, including Extinction Rebellion, Climate Emergency, 350.org, all of these groups that are going to be demonstrating tomorrow, if we understand them as the immune system of the earth, can we say, is this how we have a role to play? We have an important role to play. Let's get very clear on this. We have an important role to play. The earth, our mother, is in danger. We are challenged. It's almost as if the earth is saying to us, wake up or get out of the way. Our backs are against the wall. We've learned, I think, pretty clearly in the last few years that the governments are incapable of doing it. They're too much corrupted. They're too much in the control of rich and powerful people and forces and corporations. We have to do what we can. Maybe this is how we answer that fundamental question that Harari pointed to at the very end of his book. Maybe this is pointing to where we can, and at this point I think must find the meaning of our lives, both collectively and individually. And to end with a question, is the earth calling on all of us today to become ecosattvas? Thank you very much. I've totally lost sense of time. How are we doing? Not much, huh?
I lost sense of time too. I'm sure you're going to have some discussion and dialogue. Yes. So why don't we do that?
Yeah. Okay. As sometimes happens, often happens, I lost sense of time. So maybe given opportunity. Some people I know, you have time issues, so please feel free if you want to take off. And those who want to stay behind, then we can have some discussion. So don't be shy. I've kept you too long.
We have a mic if you have a question, so just raise your hand. We'll bring it to you if you need it. If you don't need it, we won't bring it. Yes, over in the corner. Gloria.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I'm just I'm familiarizing myself with your knowledge base, and question I have is, you're talking about a reconstructing of the self, but if it's a socialized construct, what would I end up with a reconstructed self? What does that look like?
What I tried to say, and probably didn't say very well, is the heart of the reconstruction is transforming our motivations. And if we do that, then we will actually not only act differently, but we will perceive the world, perceive other people differently. And they'll also tend to perceive us and respond to us differently as well. So that's really the heart of it. And so it's sort of transforming some deep-rooted selfish motivations into more altruistic ones. And here's that quotation from Spinoza is pointing to that great paradox that I think we see all over, that people who live for themselves, the meaning of my life is my own pleasure, my own happiness, it doesn't work, right? Do they really become happy? Whereas the people who actually are more altruistic and more loving, they are loved. They find joy, they find happiness in sort of, I want to call it the side effect, but it's something more powerful than that. It's just like trying to really live in a way that helps other people. It binds us together, and it does sort of fulfill something deep within us that I think tends to make us more happy.
So, more of the path of the Bodhisattva.
So, yeah, in effect, that's right. But the other thing to emphasize about the Bodhisattva, what's so important about it, and frankly I think this is the most important thing that Buddhism can contribute today, the Bodhisattva has a double path. She or he, they continue to work on their own personal transformation, their own meditation, their own spiritual path. But they know that that's not sufficient. They don't just try to get their own equanimity or just sit on their own butts, whatever, and sort of wallow in emptiness or something. They know that the other side of that is getting out into the world and becoming engaged. And it makes sense if you think about it. If the fundamental problem is sense of separation, if the awakening involves seeing through the delusion of separation, well, then my well-being isn't separate from your well-being. Or in Buddhist terms, how can I be fully enlightened until everyone else is too? It's like it just kind of binds us together in a really important way. So the Bodhisattva continues to work on both sides of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
No.
Hi there. Thank you for your talk. My name is Jason. I'm a sessional here at SFU in Humanities and Faculty of Environment. And I want to think through this question of the relationship between your, or I guess Buddhism's general concept of no self and the sixth great extinction. So we're in the midst of a major extinction event. You said extermination event. I think that's apt. But I'm trying to think through this question of the concept of no self and the source of suffering as attachment or desire. And it seems like there could be a danger in a Buddhism that is completely detached and completely divorced from the intrinsic value of a species, because it's all just in flux, right? I mean, the world is in flux, and some species come and some species go, and some species are exterminated by humans and others by asteroids. So help me think through Buddhism as a theory of value as well as a virtue ethic. Mm-hmm. How can we talk about the real pain and grief that we should attach to the extinction of something that has an existence value, without kind of falling into quietism or, moving outside of the notion that these species have a real value.
All right. Thank you. I think that's a really important question. I wonder if our usual understanding and practice of Buddhism is one-sided, in the sense that why do we come to Buddhist practice, right? Why do we spend all this time, money, effort, meditating, whatever? It's because there's some dukkha in us, right? I mean, it might just be a kind of existential angst, who am I kind of thing, but it's going to have to be something that pushes us into it. And at that level, at the beginning of our practice, it almost exclusively involves letting go of what it is that we've been identifying with. And the goal is, as it were, then to realize, I mean, in Buddhism we talk about emptiness, to realize the emptiness of the self in particular. And I think the one-sidedness is the tendency, because most of us are beginners, is to sort of think that that's what it's about. But I think it's only one-sided. Just like the Heart Sutra says, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. If we don't cling or wallow to the emptiness is not a place to be. The emptiness is kind of like a pure creative potential that wants to take form, that wants to become engaged, you see. And insofar as this is connected with realization of non-duality, that we're embedded in the world, it wants to get out there. And the traditional concern for the Bodhisattva is, okay, waking up, feeling non-separate, what do you see? You see a lot of suffering in the world. And therefore, you can say the path of the Bodhisattva is addressing that suffering. Although, the other thing I'd want to add to that is, the more positive way of expressing it is to work for the flourishing of life as well. I mean, just only talking about dukkha, suffering, is kind of negative. I think one doesn't have to think about it only in that terms, even though that's the traditional Buddhist term. So, but here's the point. The way it was always expressed to me, and I think it's right, is when we have an awakening, compassion, this concern is something that springs up spontaneously. That it's something that doesn't have to be forced or conditioned. It's simply because one doesn't feel separate from other people. This is simply what one naturally wants to do. Because the realization of no self is the liberation from all that self-preoccupation, you see. There's nothing to become real anymore. There's no sense of lack. There's no, all of those usual sort of, what's in it for me, if they really fall away, what presents itself in contrast to that? So the engagement, whether we understand it in the traditional Asian way of, say, a teacher helping a student, or acknowledging that the three poisons the Buddha talked about, greed, ill will, delusion, that they become institutionalized in our modern society, and that we have to work on an institutional structural level as well. And in either case, I think it's the same thing, that we feel naturally, spontaneously concerned to act in ways that engage with that kind of suffering. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I really like the emptiness form emptiness relationship. But I'll get it to other folks. But I think it was a good response. Thank you.
Could you go over there and then we'll come back over here, just over here.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond as well, because I think another Buddhist concept that would be very helpful in kind of getting into to that understanding of what our purpose is, and answer that question, or why we would be active, is on the other side of emptiness is interdependence, or Thich Nhat Hanh talks about interbeing, or the Karmapa talks about interconnectedness. And if you study or look at that concept of how everything is interconnected, how any action that we take, any thought, and any, any being is connected to us, and how our meaning of our lives is just reflected all around, because of everything we do is reflected back, because we can't do anything without it having a ripple out. And so it gives us, it's very powerful.
Thank you for introducing that term, the idea of interdependence,
Yeah.
which is a better way of saying what I was trying to say.
If you pass along to that question over there, and then there's a question.
Thank you for your talk. It's highlighted a number of really important things for me, and one of the things that came across was how much optimism you have in terms of the fact that there are groups of people gathering, that people used to talk personally about a nervous breakdown, but then people used to translate that into an opportunity to spiritually evolve. And I think that perhaps what you're illustrating to us today is that we as humanity collectively have this opportunity right in our face to spiritually evolve. And so what I see from what you're saying, Hae-Soon gave a talk recently at UBC, and she said, regeneration from the vital core. And this component that you just spoke about the spontaneity, once we deal with the illusion, of the desire for not only ourselves to evolve, but collectively for everyone to evolve, in conjunction with those two things, that they interface with each other. I think they're sort of talking about it as the intersubjective now, which refers to what you were talking about. I see that us gathering here, you catalyzing that, and the people who are bringing us, is an illustration of the fact that humanity is awakening and that there is hope. And I think that the emphasis of Bodhisattva is, I think, to generate that sense of hope rather than the sense of the separation or the fear. And I really like the fact that you brought that to our attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I can understand how you picked that up from my talk, but I should emphasize I am not optimistic and I am not hopeful. In this sense, that, you know, the definition of a pessimist, somebody who has had to live with an optimist. It's that duality. And the same thing with hope and despair. You know, it's like, I think it's really important to distinguish that, especially the despair, from grief. At this particular point, I think it's really important for us to get in touch with our grief, to get in touch with our grief for what's happening right now. But that's different than despair. Grief is like a bodily sensation that's very uncomfortable, and so we tend to run away from it, get angry, projects, hope, despair. That's the other duality, hope and despair. You know, we bounce from one to the other. It's all about future. Hope is some image of the future that I hold on to. And when I can't hold on to that, then I fall into despair. The Bodhisattva path is different from both of those. And I know this is I know this is not so easy to communicate. There's a famous Zen koan where the student asks the master, what's the constant activity of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas? What are enlightened people doing all the time? And the answer is very simple: responding appropriately, right here and now. One of my teachers, Robert Loy, said our path isn't about clearing up the mystery, but making the mystery clear, in the sense that we don't really know what's happening. We don't know how it's going to unfold. It looks bad, but we don't know. We know things can change very quickly. But a fundamental teaching for bodhisattvas is don't know mind. Our task is, the bodhisattva path emphasizes non-attachment to results, which can easily be misunderstood. What that really means is our task is to do the very best we can right here and now, not knowing if anything we do is going to make any difference whatsoever.
And I agree with you.
If you don't, rather than getting into dialogue between two people,
yeah.
no, it's fine. Just if you have other people to ask questions.
Yeah.
Over here. Sorry.
And just a final word there is, I think that being able to act without attachment to results in that sense is very, very difficult to do unless one has some personal grounding in meditation or some other kind of spiritual practice. Then that, I think, enables us to keep to here and now, doing the best. You know, we think strategically. You know, we're not just sort of flailing around symbolic actions. We try to accomplish something. If it doesn't happen, that's okay. Our job is to do the best we can, and after that, it's out of our hands. Yeah. Thank you. I'm not so sure that actually there's that big a difference between us. It may be more of a language thing.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, somebody else. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks very much for your talk, David. I might be the opposite. I grew up with a pessimist, so I think I'm an optimist. I have no choice, which has led to my having an attitude of never give up, I guess. The climate strike starts tomorrow. There's a big culmination a week tomorrow with Greta Thunberg in Montreal. So it's a big day for Canada, I think, that day. And listening to what you were saying about the 3 poisons, so I've been working on climate change responses for a really long time. And I think there is too much of ill will infusing the debate. So there's a lot of finger pointing, there's a lot of blame, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of criticism, and there's a lot of us and them, let's say those oil CEOs or these politicians, or this, that, and the other. And so I really appreciated what you were saying about the generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom being the alternative path. And I really hope that we can bring that to the climate strikes, because maybe infusing them with that energy will produce a better result than we've been having.
Curiously, if I hadn't arranged to do this so many months earlier, I would be demonstrating in Denver, because I'm a member of Extinction Rebellion in Colorado, and we have our events. One of the things you really said, and I want to highlight it because it's so important, for Buddhism, unlike the Abrahamic traditions, it seems to me, the fundamental duality is not good versus evil. The world it's not a battleground of good and evil forces. For Buddhism, the fundamental issue is delusion versus wisdom, or ignorance versus awakening. And the idea that somehow we're all caught up in some way or another in these systems of delusion. And it's not about, blaming but really doing what we can. Can you get it?
Yeah, it just so happens that I'm working with a group of very good students in Humanities 101 on some of the dialogues of Plato. And I just thought I'd bring to light the fact that for some people in the room who may not know, but Socrates had a very similar position on virtue, and that the destructive forces of humanity actually come from ignorance. And the more you awaken, the more you cultivate wisdom, the better off you'll be. And he also spoke out strongly during the Ecology, during his defense in court, saying that there's nothing wrong with wealth. I think the Buddhist position fundamentally is the same. There's nothing wrong, it's nothing inherently wrong with wealth, or even with the capacity to influence other people. It's the roots of it, right? So Socrates, it's the same thing. It's the root has to be virtue and wisdom. If wealth and power come from that root, we'll be okay. But you can't reverse the two. Another point I thought was interesting. You mentioned the early Greek division. Greek division of human culture and nature, and that division yielded democracy. I just wanted to point out that in China, in the same period, of course, Confucian belief, as it manifests in the Analects of Confucius, was that there was a firm division between the natural world and the pattern world of human beings. And out of that did not rise democracy. So it's just an interesting point to keep in mind. And finally, that activism was alive and well in China during the same period that you're referencing in terms of the Greeks. So Mengzi, a famous philosopher of the 4th century BCE, railed against having fishing nets that had holes that were too small and would diminish the yields of fish, and this was a big problem. Or clear-cutting hillsides would destroy agriculture and human survival. And then the Taoists, on the other hand, reinforcing or stating the connection with the world, with the earth as mother, and the sky as father, and the children, using a kind of Confucian overlay, have a moral responsibility and obligation to the parents who gave them life. So I just thought, they're just some thoughts rolling around in my head.
Yeah, thank you for that. If I can just make one comment, I mean, it doesn't need response. But the whole thing about wealth, right? It's like, supposedly Jesus said, it's easier for
I have a needle.
right, the eye of a needle,
Yeah, for a camel, it has to be eye of a needle.
right, than it is for a rich man to go to heaven. That's not Buddhist. The Buddha was very clear that wealth can actually be a real boon.
Yeah.
And maybe it was a good thing because the Sangha depended on dana, right? But he said the important thing was, how do you earn it? And how do you spend it?
Right. Motivation.
Yeah.
The last thing, yeah.
Okay, I was surprised when you started talking about hierarchies and civilizations that had hierarchies. And I found myself thinking about Robert Loy's book, The Sibling Society. We just want to be all on the same plane. We don't want hierarchy. We've lost the vertical dimension. It's all horizontal. And I'm very curious how you see us making the transition from our fear of hierarchy, it seems to me, to the, and I like what you had to say about hierarchy, that we know our place and what our function is.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that helps me to clarify. Yeah, I'm not against hierarchies in and of themselves, right? Like, we need leaders. Anybody remember Occupy? You know, I mean, that was going nowhere because they were so suspicious of leaders. The issue is not getting at leaders, it's how do they evolve and what is their responsibility. And the same thing is with hierarchies. I mean, hierarchies have a function to play. The problem with the hierarchies that I was talking about is that they were very oppressive. It was very much top-down in the sense that the people at the top really did exploit, you know, pretty terribly the people at the bottom. I mean, I think of the slaves building the Egyptian pyramids, you know, for the immortal souls or whatever of the pharaohs of Egypt. Yeah. So I don't mean to imply that all hierarchies are bad, but I also think it's pretty clear that we need to find ways of creating leaders who have a sense of responsibility to work for the well-being of others rather than simply exploiting them. Yeah. We could say more, but I think that's enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.